leadership roles in community and professional organizations, including the Kinsmen's Club of Belleville, Industrial Accident Prevention Association, Retail Council of Canada, Canadian Association of Chiefs of Police, Canadian Society for Industrial Security, Loyalist College Justice Studies Board, Canadian Provost Corp Association, and 2 military police unit and regiment senate. In 2010, Bob was presented with the Minister of Veteran Affairs Commendation, and in 2017, Bob received the Sovereign's Medal for Volunteers. He's active in our community, serving as Vice President and Veterans Office with the Waterdown Legion, and is a long-standing member of the Warriors Day Parade Council. He serves as a veteran representative on the History Committee of the Canadian Forces Military Police Academy, and in 2019 was recognized for outstanding service and awarded life membership in the Royal Canadian Legion. He's also a participant in the Memory Project for speakers, and that's how we hooked up with Bob tonight, because they do great work. So without further ado, you can keep your videos on if you like. Just remember that we can see you if you yawn or leave the room. And everybody is muted unless you want to ask a question. All right, Bob, share your screen.
Well, I think you said it all, Lynn. You can all go home now. That's the presentation. Actually, thank you so much for inviting me to be a part of the meeting this evening. And I noted in the outline a suggestion that I'm the face of the Waterdown Legion. I just want you to know that I am one face of the many volunteers that donate their time, talent, and money to keep our branch alive so we can support local veterans and veterans at large, and also to open up our doors to help the many community organizations. At our Waterdown Legion, we are also truly fortunate to have a great ladies auxiliary that help and support us in many ways. That's my commercial for the Waterdown Legion. And I just have one more short commercial and then I'll get on with the subject at hand. My participation this evening is part of the Memory Project. It's a component of Historica Canada. The Memory Project maintains a volunteer speakers bureau that arranges for veterans and serving members of our Canadian Armed Forces to share their experiences with schools and other community groups. This creates opportunities for more open conversations about Canada's military history and its role at home and abroad. In the brief period we have this evening, I would like to cover with you a bit about my background, what life was like serving in Canada's military in the 1950s and 1960s during what was known as the Cold War period. A thumbnail sketch of the situation in the mid-60s on the ground in Cyprus and the Sinai Desert, and a soldier's perspective about peacekeeping. And hopefully we'll have a little time for some questions. Members of my family served in World War I and World War II, and I have always been interested in the military. Throughout history, considering our small population, Canada has made significant contributions when called upon to defend our allies or to have influence towards world peace. We have not always been the best prepared for conflict, nor have we always supplied our troops with the most up-to-date equipment. However, our military have, and they continue to be trained to think, be creative, and make the best of what we have on hand. Other than 2 very brief periods during World War I and World War II, our forces have always been made up of volunteers, people that have signed on the dotted line and literally given a blank check to the government and people of Canada for everything up to and including their life. While a student at West Hill High School in Montreal, I joined the Army Cadet Corps that was affiliated with the Victoria Rifles of Canada. Our instructors were teachers, and many of them were World War II veterans. Once a week, we proudly wore our uniforms to school and we paraded after class. On Saturday mornings, I would take the streetcar to the Victoria Rifles Armory on Cathcart Street, where we would practice our shooting skills at the indoor range. I left home and school when I was 14 years old, and I went to work as an office boy with the Canadian National Railways. When I was 15 years old, a co-worker invited me to consider joining the Reserve Army. With his help, I became a member of three-column Royal Canadian Army Service Corps. Column were responsible for providing transport support for the reserve units in Montreal and the surrounding area. We were situated in the Blair Street Armory. Your workhorse vehicles were 3-ton international state trucks, and they also had motorcycles. That really perked my interest because at that point I already owned a BSA motorcycle. I conveniently changed my date of birth, and as far as the Canadian Army was concerned, I was born 15 months earlier than my actual birth date. When I tell this story, often people roll their eyes and I get the response, oh, I've heard that one before. But if you have a look at the upper right corner of my application, this is part of the official military record, you'll note that my date of birth is listed as the 8th of September, 1941. So according to the Canadian Army, I was 80 years old last September. In fact, I was born on the 18th of December, 1942, and I'm meant to celebrate my 80th birthday. So you can hold off for a little while with the birthday cards. I learned how to drive the 3-ton trucks. And to get my qualification, I was evaluated by a regimental sergeant major from the regular force, who was part of our instructional staff. For any of you that have served in the military, you know that regimental sergeant majors are akin to God. We started up at Water Hill, one of the steepest ones in Montreal. Halfway up the hill, he said, "Soldier, stop the truck. You have a watch?" I acknowledged, "Yes, sir, I do own one." "Give me your watch." With that, he got out of the vehicle and he returned a brief time later and he said, "A soldier, your watch is under the rear wheels, so you don't want to slip backwards." Working the clutch and the handbrake, I was able to avoid rolling back. Shortly after getting the truck moving, I pulled over and stopped. His comment was, "What are you doing?" My reply was words to the effect, "Wanted to go back for my watch as I did not have a lot of money and I needed it to tell time." With that, with a big smile on his face, he reached in his pocket and he handed me my watch with the comment that I did an excellent job. It was good to find that someone with that much authority had a good sense of humor. When I was 16 years old, under the watchful eye of Sergeant Russ Miller, I was put through the paces of the Army motorcycle training. Could not believe my good fortune. The Canadian Army was paying me to ride a motorcycle. We would escort convoys where I would straddle my bike in an intersection and stop the traffic. When the last truck arrived, the race was on. Get back in front of the convoy. What a life. When I was 17 years old, I joined the regular Army, serving in the Canadian Provost Corp. We were the Army military police. We went through 6 months of very intensive military and police training. This is a photo of our class doing a physical training demonstration at the time of our graduation. I had the easy part, being the top of the heap. The previous work experience of our class members was quite varied and included fishing, ranching, farming, policing, logging, game warden, and we even had a miner from Cape Breton Island. The members of our class came from all parts of Canada, and following graduation, I was posted to 2 Provo Platoon in Camp Petawawa. We provided police support for the 2nd Canadian Infantry Brigade Group. This is a photo of our platoon taken in Camp Petawawa in the fall of 1962. We were quite self-contained as we had our own cook, vehicle mechanic, and ordnance clerk. It was during the Cold War, and some of you may remember the unsettling times we lived in during this period. In February 1946, the Canadian government gave political asylum to Igor Gazinko, cipher clerk from the Canadian Soviet Embassy in Ottawa. Gazinko left the embassy with documents clearly proving that the Soviets had been spying on its wartime allies, Canada, Britain, and the United States. Over the next years, many nations spent time and resources preparing for the possibility of a nuclear war. Some families went as far as to build shelters that were stocked with food and water, and they held regular drills in case the air raid siren went off and they knew what they needed to do. Bomb shelters were built to protect key officials in the event of an attack. Famous Diefenbunker was built in Carp, a community near Ottawa. Similar shelters were built to house some provincial government personnel. And I'd like to share with you a personal experience from this period. In the fall of 1961, all commercial air traffic over Canada was grounded for 12 hours. This allowed Canada and the United States to evaluate our early warning systems. We also checked the physical security arrangements at key military installations. I was sent with a small group from our Provo platoon to infiltrate and destroy the radar station at Foymount, Ontario. I don't mean to physically destroy it, but as an exercise to show that we could do it. Our section of 2 managed to crawl under a wire fence, and our primary target was the operations center and the secondary target, the base fire hall. We arrived at the fire hall first, and conveniently we found that the trucks were all parked outside. After loading the trucks with bombs, we set out for the other target. Hiding in the shadows, we were able to pick up the entry code words. When the door opened for us, we threw our bombs inside, and then we were taken prisoners. At the guardhouse, we were offered cigarettes and coffee. And then the base intelligence officer decided he was going to interrogate us. The conversation went something like this. Where are you from? Fantasia. Who sent you? Walt Disney. Well, promptly our coffee and our cigarettes were taken from us, and we were thrown in the slammer until the end of the exercise. In the fall of 1962, the world came very close to an all-out nuclear war when the Soviets installed ballistic missiles on the island of Cuba. The Canadian forces were put on high alert, and a soldier knows at this point some serious stuff was on the horizon. The world held its breath for 13 days as the United States and Soviets headed closer to war. It ended when Soviet Premier Khrushchev agreed to dismantle and remove the missiles in return for President Kennedy's promise not to invade Cuba. For years, many Canadians believed that the Canadian Armed Forces leading role was. This is simply not true, as most of our military resources were training and preparing to stave off aggression from the Soviets. Having said all that, Canada does have an excellent record in the peace arena. However, it was never our primary mission. It should also be noted that it is often being said that peacekeeping is not a soldier's job. However, only a soldier can do it. During my time with the 2nd Canadian Infantry Brigade Group in Camp Petawawa, we spent a lot of time in the field conducting exercises. The soldier on the right side of the Jeep was my section sergeant, Charlie Fournier. Charlie fought with the Royal 22nd Regiment in Korea, and then he later transferred to our corps. He was one of the finest soldiers I had the pleasure of serving with. Unfortunately, the year after this photo was taken, Charlie died in a boating accident. You'll note that I've got a submachine gun, and that was our personal weapon with the Provo platoon. We also had 9mm pistols, FN-C1, C2 rifles at headquarters. We had a 3.5-inch anti-tank rocket launcher. Once a year, we had to qualify on all the weapons that we had in the platoon. And it was always a lot of fun the day we went out on the range with the rocket launcher. We always looked forward to that. In 1962 and 1963, we moved the brigade to Camp H-Town for summer concentration. Second and third brigades were pitted against each other in simulated battle. The brigades moved often because of the threat of tactical nuclear weapons. In the field, sleep was almost non-existent. We would finish one move and we would start planning the next. In 1964, the Canadian government committed troops to serve with the United Nations forces on the troubled island of Cyprus. This island is steeped in history, and in 1964, population was made up of approximately 80% Greek origin, 18% Turkish origin, and 2% of assorted nationalities. Until 1960, the island was under British rule. For about 4 years before their independence, the Greek Cypriots, with help from mainland Greece, fought the British forces. Under the agreement signed by the parties in 1960 for independence, 30% of the government and all public offices had to be held by Cypriots. President, Archbishop Macarius, was also head of the Greek Orthodox Church. Vice President was a Turk. And each Turkish member of parliament individually had the power of veto. So from 1960 to 1963, absolutely nothing went through their parliament because the Greeks would put forward a bill and one of the Turk representatives would stand up and they would veto it. Also under the agreement, Turkey and Greece were permitted to have a limited number of regular army troops on the island, and Britain maintained 2 sovereign bases. When the fighting broke out in December 1963, it was vicious and it spread all over the island. Other than the Green Lines and the Kyrenia Pass, villages from both factions were interspersed. In March 1964, it was agreed that a contingent of United Nations troops would be stationed in Cyprus with the goal of keeping the warring factions apart while the diplomats could try and work out a lasting peace. I was advised on a Sunday evening that I would have the next day to prepare. Monday was a flurry of activity, including a short briefing of what we could expect on arrival. The young officer reported that he really did not know what we were heading into. However, he suggested when we got off the plane, we would see a bunch of foreigners. Then he reminded us that we would be the foreigners and we were there as guests of the country and that we should act accordingly. Looking back, it was probably the shortest, yet the most impactful briefing I ever received during my military service. Early on Tuesday morning, our draft was on a bus headed for Trenton, Ontario, and the following day we flew to Marville, France, stayed overnight, and the next day we landed in Nicosia, Cyprus. I was 21 years of age, and this was my first airplane ride. Before arriving in France, we were instructed to conceal all of our United Nations insignia because their president, Charles de Gaulle, did not want any UN troops on French soil. Within a few years, all Canadian military bases were moved from France to Germany. This is a photo of yours truly the day after arriving in Nicosia. And initially, we looked after security of the Nicosia Zone headquarters. And then after a few days, we started forming the Nicosia Zone Military Police Company. The company included military police members from Ireland, Great Britain, Finland, Denmark, and Canada. We worked from government buildings known as Wolseley Barracks that were located just outside the walled city of Nicosia, and we were quartered in tents on the Green Line. This was our home for 6 months. Before the fighting, the grounds had been the Nicosia Golf and Country Club. Sounds pretty fancy. However, it was not in particularly decent shape when we took it over from the British paratroopers. You will note the large UN letters on the ground and the rooftop. We hoped that this would deter the warring factions from bombing us. We were issued ridiculously cheap tent cots that after 1 week resembled a pretzel. 2 soldiers shared a wood locker, and we made do with dirt floors. On occasion, the warring factions would open fire on each other, and we would roll out of our cots and keep our heads down in the foxholes You'll see the foxholes around the tents. In July 1964, we came close to an all-out war between Turkey and Greece. This was a dire situation because both countries are part of the NATO alliance. One evening, we were advised to hit the foxholes because there was intelligence that the Turkish Air Force were going to bomb Nicosia. I was sitting on the edge of a foxhole with a few other Canadian military police officers when a bullet came over our heads just near the end of its flight. Then shortly after, a Turk fighter came at us at extremely low altitude. When they're that low and going that fast, you don't really hear them until they're right on top of you. I was smoking at the time, and when I ducked down into the foxhole, I burnt the arm of one of our guys. After leaving Cyprus in 1964, the next time I saw this gentleman was at a Canadian Provost Corp reunion in Montreal, which was 30 years later. On entering the mess, he came up and he punched me with some force in the arm. Manuel had served in the permanent force before World War II, so he was getting up there in age, but he was still a very powerful man. When I inquired what the assault was about, he replied that it was for burying him in a foxhole in Cyprus. Spent the rest of the evening reminiscing about the 6 months we shared in Cyprus and some of the characters we met along the way. The walled city of Nicosia was out of bounds to all UN troops after 6 o'clock at night, except for on-duty soldiers on the Green Line. And our patrols enforced the curfew, and we conducted general police patrols in the Nicosia zone area and in no man's land. This is Omerfida, a suburb in the northern part of Nicosia and an example of no man's land. All the evidence pointed to a scene of a massacre. You'll note the bullet holes on the outside walls of the buildings, and on entering the buildings, we found blood all over the floors and walls shed by innocent civilians. In Cyprus, vehicles are right-hand drive, and they travel on the left side of the road. When we arrived, there was no time for driver training, so we learned on the job. This resulted in us investigating many motor vehicle collisions. The first day on the job, I was sent to do a patrol in the walled city. The sergeant cautioned me that when I entered Kaffa's gate, to not hang around too long, as the Turks had a machine gun position in a side street, and occasionally they opened fire on the police station inside the gate. Before arriving at the wall, I had about 1 kilometer to try and figure out how to drive a right-hand drive Land Rover on the opposite side of the road. Remembering the sergeant's words, I hit the gas pedal to get past the gun position. What he did not tell me was that just past the alley, I had to make a very sharp right turn to go into the walled city. Going way too fast, I started climbing stairs with pedestrians fleeing in all directions. Fortunately, I didn't hit anyone, and the only damage was done to the rim on the Land Rover I was driving. In 1974, Turkish troops invaded, and they soon controlled about 40% of the northern part of the island, now known as the Turkish Republic of Northern Cyprus. During our commitment to supply troops for service in Cyprus, 29 Canadians gave their lives, along with 155 peacekeepers from other countries. Following my tour, I returned to Canada and I served on Camp Gordon Tovedy. In the fall of 1965, I was put on a draft for the United Nations Emergency Force at the Gaza Strip and the Sinai Desert. We flew to Marville, France on a Yukon turboprop plane, stayed overnight, and then we boarded a Hercules cargo plane with a stopover in PZ. Next day, we arrived in El Arish, and when they opened the ramp, it felt like we had just arrived in hell. On arrival, we're immediately warned not to drink the water or eat any local food. A condition known as gypogut is quite prevalent, and as someone once said, it will lie low the strongest of the strong. In the year I spent with the United Nations Emergency Force, I managed to get it a few times, and it was not a very pleasant experience. We were also warned to watch out for spiders, scorpions, and snakes, few of which were very poisonous. bite from a sand viper without immediate medical attention is deadly. Before getting into bed at night, we would pull our beds apart to make sure that we had no unwanted visitors. And boots were tipped upside down before putting your feet in them because they were a favorite place for the scorpions to get in and take up residence. The United Nations Emergency Force was the first major deployment of troops in the arena of peacekeeping. It was the brainchild of Lester B. Pearson, who was Canada's Minister of External Affairs at the time, and then went on to be our Prime Minister. Recognition of this diplomatic breakthrough, Mr. Pearson was awarded the Nobel Peace Prize. In 1956, Egypt nationalized the Suez Canal. Britain and France believed this action to be a threat to their national security. On 29 October 1956, Israel attacked Egypt, and 2 days later, Britain and France joined the fray. Lester Pearson promoted the idea of an emergency force under the United Nations banner. The first person to lead the force was Canadian Major General E.L. Burns, who was nicknamed Smiley because he never smiled. Egypt signed on with the condition that they were free to revoke the agreement at any time, which they did in 1967. This is a map prepared by the United Nations engineers showing our troop deployment in 1965 and 1966. In this period, troops were supplied by Brazil, Canada, a combined regiment of Danish and Norwegian soldiers, India, Sweden, and the former Yugoslavia. You will note on the upper part of the map that United Nations troops were a buffer on the armistice demarcation line between Gaza and Israel. The Gaza Strip was under control of the Egyptian army. The governor was an Egyptian military officer. There was absolutely no shortage of secret police all over the place in Palestine at that time. We also patrolled the international frontier between Israel and Egypt. Our Canadian Reconnaissance Squadron patrolled with jeeps that were equipped with 30 caliber machine guns, and they had 2 line camps along the frontier. Where the ground patrols ended, Royal Canadian Air Force aircraft flew 2 runs a day over the border with an observer. Under the 1956 agreement, Israel occupied land right up to the border, and on the Egyptian side, there was a 500-meter neutral zone patrolled by the United Nations, and a 1,000-meter line for the Egyptian army were permitted. Edwards occupied the land between the 500 and 1,000-meter lines. And there were many unmarked minefields in the desert, so we had to exercise extreme caution, and the rule to survive was to always stay on a marked path. This is the approach to Fort Robinson on the frontier of Israel and Egypt. On occasion, Bedouins would arrive at our camps with live mines that they had found in the desert. When our Canadian Reconnaissance Squadron was pulled out, forts were taken over by Brazilian soldiers. One of their patrols actually loaded up a live mine and brought it into their main camp, and this, of course, caused quite a stir. When the Egyptian and the Israeli armies buried the mines in the desert, they were set to probably go off with about 200 pounds pressure. After resting in the ground for years, it might take 2 pounds or 2 tons to set them off. Shortly after their first scare, the Bedouins dropped off another gift for them, this mine that you can see on the left side in the trench. I escorted an engineer out to the camp to detonate the mine, wanting to send a very clear message to the Brazilian soldiers. While we went more than a little overboard with the explosives that we packed around the mine. On detonation, we left a huge crater and we blew all the windows out of their camp. There was a few wide-eyed Brazilian soldiers looking on. The UN headquarters was in Gaza, and the Canadian contingent stationed in Camp Rafah were in a support role, providing policing, transport, mechanics, ordnance, engineers, and signal services. The Canadian Provost or military police were responsible for conducting criminal and traffic collision investigations. Our Royal Canadian Air Force team was stationed in El Arish, where they shared the runways with the Egyptian Air Force. There was also a United Nations detachment at Sharm el-Sheikh to monitor and ensure passage of shipping through the Straits of Tiran. Shipping had to go through this very narrow strait to access the Israeli port of Elath and the Jordanian port of Aqaba. Most of my time was in Camp Gordon detachment, and I spent about 1 month at the UN headquarters in Gaza. Initially, I was dispatched to be the non-commissioned officer in charge of the United Nations Military Police Detachment in Beirut. This was a favorite leave destination for United Nations troops from Egypt and Cyprus. 3 Beirut City police officers were assigned to our office, and we collaborated closely with them to maintain discipline with the visiting United Nations troops. In 1966, the Canadian Recce Squadron was pulled out, and a decision was made to build unmanned guard towers on the frontier. We suggested to New York that this was not a very clever idea, because anything left attended on the desert would be fair game for the Bedouins. The Bedouins are incredibly unique people. Sometimes we would visit with them in the desert, and a visitor is always well received and granted hospitality. I had a few meals with them, and I was never quite sure what I was eating. Eating is done out of communal bowls with no utensils. Only 3 fingers and the thumb of the right hand are used to scoop up the food. It takes some practice before you get it right. Before that, you end up wearing a lot of food. Back to the tower. Just after it was finished, we got word that it had disappeared. Note the uniform worn by the Egyptian police officer. It's quite like what our troops were issued in World War I. In the other photo, I'm practicing my riding skills on a dromedary or one-hump camel. When we visited the scene of the crime, one could see the tracks where the lumber had been dragged out into the desert. We were not about to follow them through the unmarked minefields. I was a duty investigator in Camp Rafah on New Year's Day, 1966. One of our camp guards advised me that there was a cart pulled by a donkey with an injured man at our front gate. 2 men with him wanted to take the injured man to our hospital. I attended, and I checked the man, and he was obviously dead from gunshot wounds. Some of our doctors and nurses spoke Arabic, so I authorized them to escort them to the hospital, and they would be able to tell them about the situation in a much more humane way than I could. Shortly after, the Egyptian police officer in this picture arrived. He related that the victim was a Bedouin, and he was shot by a member of another tribe because of a murder that had taken place before this young man was even born. I inquired what form his investigation would take. He replied that he would gather the information without visiting the tribes and prepare a report. It would be worth his life to go out and interview members of the 2 tribes in the desert. My interest was that this feud would carry on, and he reported that the 2 leaders of the tribes would hold a council, and they would decide if that were the end of the matter or if the feud would carry on going forward. With all its faults, I think I would prefer our system of justice. Although it was a long year, we did make the best of it. Communication home was limited to fold-up blue lettergrams, and we also had a ham radio operator, and I managed to speak with my mother in Montreal twice during the year. We had a baseball league, and our team won the championship twice in the year. Some of you folks that are maybe around my age may remember Gary Unger, who played in the National Hockey League. I'm sitting beside his dad, Jack Unger. We're the last 2 on the right in the back row. Jack was a warrant officer in the Canadian Signal. As part of our entertainment, we would watch movies and special events like the Stanley Cup playoffs. That year, Montreal played and beat Detroit for the Cup. When the film arrived of each game, we already knew the score because we got the newspapers first. This did not stop us from sitting on the patio and cheering on our team, though I was the only one cheering for Montreal. Some of you may remember Gordy Tapp of Country Hoedown and Hee Haw fame, or also as the face of the commercials for Ultramatic beds. He was a great guide. He was quite local, living in Burlington. He put together a group of entertainers to travel each year to visit with their troops serving overseas. In 1966, Jean Beliveau, the captain of the Montreal Canadiens, was part of this tour. When he came into our mess, the regimental sergeant major brought Jean over and introduced me as the only Montreal fan in Camp Rafa. Jean was a first-class gentleman, and he did a lot for hockey and the Montreal Canadiens. At the request of my children and grandchildren, I recently put to paper some of my experiences. And one of the questions they asked me was, what did we do to entertain ourselves on overseas postings? I shared with them a story of two older sergeants in our mess drinking way more than they should, who got into an argument about who could walk the fastest. Another member of the mess stood quietly by, and the next morning there were signs posted all around Camp Rafa announcing the great race Sunday. Invitations were sent out to the other contingents, and radio speakers were set up on the patio of our mess. One of our members had been a radio announcer while serving in Germany, and he was mounted in a Jeep with a link back to our mess to provide a play-by-play for the gathered spectators. Beer stations were strategically located to refresh the combatants on the route. I was invited to start the race, and I grabbed a shotgun from the detachment armory. One of the managers was mounted on a donkey and the other on a camel. When I popped around from the shotgun in the air, the camel took off, and we did not see him or the manager until well after the race. No doubt he thought he was off to meet up with Lawrence of Arabia for a charge on Tobruk. The other nations who joined us thought the Canadians were crazy, and we did not do anything to dispel that theory. For the rest of our tour, we never heard the two combatants arguing again who was superior to the other. I returned to Canada in November 1966. Before I left, it was quite evident that the Egyptian and Israeli forces were preparing for war, and it did happen early 1967. If you are interested in learning more about the United Nations Emergency Force from 1956 to 1967, there's an excellent book written by Michael Carroll, Person's Peacekeeper. I checked, and the book is available at the Hamilton Public Library, although there's a list of people waiting for it. And I did an interview with Michael when he was doing his research for the book. In the 10 years of the United Nations Emergency Force, 32 Canadians gave their lives. Most are buried in the British War Cemetery in Gaza. This cemetery has been proudly maintained by the same Palestinian family for many years. A family member on the payroll of the British War Cemetery Commission compelled to retire at age 65. And even though retired, they continue to support their son, who was taken over. Until the 1970s, our fallen were buried where they died. And Canada now brings our dead home. There are cemeteries all over the world that are the final resting place for our Canadian service personnel. I'm often asked if our service with the United Nations was worth it. And I believe if we were not in these countries that were at war, many more innocent people would have died. While we were acting as a buffer between the combatants, there was an opportunity or a chance to find some peaceful solutions. So yes, we did not solve all the problems of the world, but our presence did make life better, especially for the civilian populations where we serve. War should never be glorified. Often it is the civilians who are caught up in the conflict who suffer the most. On return to Canada, I was posted to National Defence Headquarters, where during Centennial Year, I was part of this investigation. And I took my release in 1968, and as Lynn related, re-signed again in 1969 to become the Provost Sergeant of the Edward Regiment, which I did probably for about a year and a half, and then they did away with my vacancy, and they asked if I wanted to remuster to infantry, and I said that no. Here I am riding my 1956 Triumph motorcycle in the Warriors Day Parade at the Canadian National Exhibition. This is identical to the motorcycles I rode when I was serving with the Royal Canadian Army Service Corps, and also in the Provo Corps. We use motorcycles mainly for patrolling camps. I've been a member of the Warriors Day Parade Council for over 20 years. And as Lynn mentioned, I also serve on the History Committee of the Canadian Forces Military Police Academy in Gordon. My military service gave me an opportunity to see and experience other countries and their cultures. And additionally, I had the pleasure of working with military police officers from other countries. The training and deployments gave me a foundation and a much greater appreciation for the fantastic country that we have the good fortune of living. Perhaps we can open up the floor, and if anyone would like to ask any questions, I'll do my best to answer them.
Thank you, Bob. That was really fascinating. Some of it I've heard before and seen your pictures, but you sure bring stuff to life. If you want to stop sharing your screen, then we can get some bigger picture here.
Right here. There we go.
Great. Does anyone have any questions for Bob? Comments?
Don't let me off this easy.
You're all muted, so if you do want to say anything. Oh my goodness. Nobody.
There's somebody got their hand up there? Nope.
No.
I will.
Sue does.
Okay. Thank you, Bob. That was very interesting to put a real face and person to things that we read about and have read about in books. So thank you for giving such an interesting talk.
Well, thank you very much.
Garth.
Hey, Bob, you mentioned about Gaza Commonwealth War Graves Cemetery.
Yes.
What do you know what the fellow's name is? Because I'm with the Commonwealth War Graves, and actually one of my friends is one of the stonemasons or whatever at Gaza. Believe it or not. I'm just ripping through my phone trying to find his name here, and I can't find it as I'm trying to go through this.
Yeah, if you go in, you can find it. It's on the website.
Okay.
I'll look for you too, and I'll send you a note if I locate it.
Yeah,
it's the same family have looked after the cemetery for years.
Okay, yeah, because you spiked me when you said about the father turning it over to the son, and that's with
right.
me because
Yes.
I knew that part of that,
Yes.
but I just can't find his name. It's on my Twitter thing here that I'm hooked in with Commonwealth War Graves. It's kind of weird.
I'll have a look and see if I can pull it up for you.
Yeah, it brings it close to home for me.
Yes.
Why is that family taking care of it?
They're paid actually to take care of it by the British War Graves Commission. So one of them is on the payroll, and but the family, it's been a tradition with that family for many years, and there's been of late both from both sides damage done to the cemetery where shells were popped into the cemetery, and they've had to do a fair bit of repair work, but it's well maintained, and as most of the cemeteries are around the world, they really make an effort to make sure that they're well taken care of.
Thank you.
Bob, it seems that your tours were a lot different than the tourist would see.
Yes, definitely. And it depends, every soldier's experience is different because it depended on what job you had, what role. For example, when I served in Cyprus, if we had a presentation from a soldier from the Royal 22nd Regiment or a soldier from the Royal Canadian Dragoons, the Recce Squadron, their side of it would be different than mine. But the one thing, even I mentioned when July 1964, we were pretty apprehensive about what was going to happen to us if Turkey and Greece did go to war. And there was a suggestion that we were going to head across the Kyrenia Pass and that the American Mediterranean fleet would pick us up off the beaches. And we thought, oh, that's great. The pass is controlled by the Turks. So that would have been a lot of fun trying to get through there. And then the other thought was that we were going to go to the airport and hold the airport and they would take us out by aircraft. At any rate, as it turned out, when the Turks invaded in 1974, the United Nations troops stayed where they were, and they were able to actually do a lot of good work because over a period of time, you build up a relationship with both sides and with the commanders, and it's always harder to kill somebody that if you know them or you have some sort of a relationship with them. So they were able to do actually a lot of good work during the invasion to try and protect, especially a lot of civilians. They didn't get caught up in it or get pulled over.
Hey, Bob, nice to see you. You look great.
Thank you.
Good question for you. Of all the, you sound like you went to a lot of different places around the world. If you had to pick one place that was your favorite, the most beautiful, which one would you say it was?
Well, Beirut was the gem of the Middle East at the time in the 60s, and sadly, a lot of it out of control of the Lebanese people because of other factions. They ended up literally destroying much of Lebanon. But it was a very progressive country. It was a financial hub of the Middle East. Cyprus was beautiful, beautiful beaches. I still think one day I'd like to go back as a tourist and visit. But both of those countries. In the Gaza Strip area, there was tremendous poverty. Most of the population were refugees, and they lived in really, really poor conditions. We ended up employing quite a few in the camp, and they were very happy about that. But a lot of them just depended, their food source was from the United Nations War Relief Agency. They would line up each week to get their food to keep their family going for the next week.
Thank you.
Garth?
Yeah, I'll add one more thing to you, Bob, which you kind of threw me there. I joined the Army in 1985, 25 years, and I was listening to what you were talking about, the weapons, and then CFB Petawawa and CFB Borden.
Mm-hmm.
We probably kicked some of the same turf there, but it was funny when you started talking about the weapons, the FNC-1, C2, that's the same things that I trained on 25 years after you did.
Yes.
And we released those in 1990 when I got out. But it was, you brought a lot of that home to me, even though I didn't go overseas. All my serving was in Canada, but just the stories and the relationships, it was like you were making my hair stand up just listening to all that. So thank you. I really appreciated that.
Well, thanks. It's amazing. I mentioned that I'm still quite involved with the Canadian Forces Military Police Academy, and they moved into their new facility, I think about 5 years ago now, and it's absolutely state of the art. It's probably one of the finest police training, not military, but police in general training facilities you'll find anywhere in the world. And I had an opportunity, they started a program where they invite veteran military police officers to mentor classes when they're going through their training. And I did that in 2017 and with one of the first groups. What an experience. It's absolutely amazing see the equipment they have today, the support they have, the training that they receive. It's absolutely first class and state of the art. What I'm really happy about in the old academy, we presented the history in a little place called Heritage Hall, which the roof leaked and there was all kinds of other problems, and we could never put out all of the good stuff we have. Then you'll probably be smiling because you're thinking the same thing's happening here. You have a lot of good stuff, but no room to put it. But now the new military police academy, the whole academy has all of the history all around it. So the military police officers in training, they see their history every day. It's all around them, which is fantastic. And we also, when we chat with them, encourage them when they go out to make sure that they get back some of their stories and memorabilia and good stuff, so that future generations will also be able to see what their story is.
Did you ever get comfortable riding a camel?
Yeah, you know what? The police, they had some super duper camels, and we'd meet up with them sometimes on the beach in Rafa and let you go for a ride. And they're amazing. The worst part is getting up, when they get up, and of course when they get down. But when they're going at full flight, those camels they had, or dromedaries, like it was almost like sitting on a magic carpet. It was just amazing. But they're a vicious animal too. During the year that I was there, they brought in a couple of civilians that had been bitten badly. One of them died. So they can be very, very vicious.
Any other questions? Well, right on just about 9 o'clock. So well done. I want to thank you so much, Bob. That was really interesting, and I think that everyone enjoyed it. And hopefully we'll see most of you at our next meeting in February. So stay
Thank you. Stay safe and stay
warm.
healthy.
Yeah. Good night.
Right.